There is a moment in history, quiet, almost invisible, when the balance of power doesn't just shift, it breaks. And right now, in one of the most strategically loaded stretches of water on the face of this earth, something is unfolding that most news channels are either missing entirely or are too cautious to say out loud. Welcome to NEXA World Brief. What you are about to hear is not a summary of headlines. This is the deeper current underneath all of it, the structural reality that explains why the next few weeks could permanently redraw the map of Middle Eastern power, global energy, and American military doctrine. Stay with me because this story goes much further than you think. There is a narrow corridor of blue water sitting between the Arabian Peninsula and the Iranian coast. At its tightest point, it measures barely 34 kilometers across. Geographers call it the Strait of Hormuz. Economists call it the jugular vein of the global oil supply. Roughly 1/5 of the world's petroleum and nearly 1/3 of all liquefied natural gas ever shipped passes through it every single day. Tankers move through it in slow, heavy lines, carrying energy that heats homes in Tokyo, powers factories in Germany, and fuels cars in Shanghai. For decades, one government understood this better than anyone else. Tehran built its entire strategic identity around the implicit threat that it could, at any moment, reach out and close that corridor, not necessarily with a formal declaration of war, but with enough harassment, intimidation, and asymmetric pressure to freeze the global economy in place. That leverage was real. And for decades, it worked. But something has changed. And the change is far more profound than any single military operation or naval deployment. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now is not simply a clash between warships. It is the moment when one side's foundational strategy, built over 40 years of careful positioning, is colliding head-on with a force it was never actually designed to survive. And what makes this moment so dangerous, so genuinely unpredictable, is that neither side has a clean exit. The pressure is not going to release cleanly. Before collapse is always the most dangerous phase. And we are in that phase right now. Here is what the surface-level reporting tells you. Iranian naval and paramilitary forces, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, spent weeks using a combination of fast attack boats, drone swarms, and implied missile threats to assert dominance over commercial shipping lanes in and around the strait. Multiple international vessels were approached, monitored, and in several documented cases directly threatened. A South Korean cargo ship became a flashpoint. Diplomatic channels were activated, warnings were issued, and every one of them was absorbed without meaningful response. The calculation in Tehran, at least as it appeared from the outside, was that economic interdependence would paralyze any serious military response, that the cost of confrontation would always be higher for everyone else than for Iran. That geography, that thin blue corridor, was a weapon no one could take away. That calculation has now been tested. And the results are not what Tehran expected. The American military response that followed did not resemble the cautious, measured escalation that characterized so many previous Gulf standoffs. What was deployed into that theater was something different in both scale and philosophical intent. Multiple Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, warships carrying hundreds of precision-guided munitions, advanced radar systems, and layered air defense networks, moved into position not as a deterrent gesture, but as an enforcement mechanism. Aircraft carrier battle groups repositioned in the Arabian Sea. Airfields in the UAE became staging platforms for over 100 combat aircraft cycling through the operational area on rotational patrols. Below the surface, nuclear-powered submarines, silent, invisible, and capable of remaining submerged for months, moved into the deep water approaches. You cannot track them. You cannot predict them. And the psychological weight of that uncertainty is, by design, as powerful as any missile. Here is what separates this moment from previous American posturing in the Gulf. This is not a show of force designed to communicate a willingness to fight. This is a show of force that is actively fighting. Fast attack boats that approached commercial vessels were engaged and destroyed. Drone swarms launched from Iranian positions were intercepted and neutralized by AI-assisted defense systems that processed targeting decisions faster than any human operator ever could. The first commercial vessels to transit under American protection completed their passage. The strait was opened, not by negotiation, not by a diplomatic framework brokered over months of careful back-channel communication. It was opened by kinetic force and the credible, demonstrated willingness to apply more of it. But here is where the narrative becomes genuinely complicated. And this is the part that most analysis skips entirely because it is uncomfortable and doesn't fit into a clean victory story. The physical act of clearing a transit corridor is not the same thing as resolving the underlying crisis. Infrastructure is becoming more powerful than military force in this conflict, and the infrastructure problem runs in multiple directions simultaneously. Yes, the American military has established what amounts to a moving wall of firepower across the width of the strait. Yes, that wall is extraordinarily difficult for Iranian forces to penetrate given the current technological mismatch between the two sides. But control of a waterway is not the same as control of the systems that depend on it. And right now, those systems are already broken in ways that will not be repaired simply because ships are moving again. Consider the economics of what has already happened. Shipping insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf spiked to levels not seen in decades the moment Iranian harassment operations began. Many carriers rerouted entirely, adding thousands of nautical miles and weeks of transit time to journeys that once took days. Global LNG spot prices jumped. Oil futures became erratic. And the financial damage from that disruption did not flow equally. It hit hardest in Asia, specifically in the economies of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which import staggering proportions of their energy through exactly this corridor. These are not minor trading partners. These are the manufacturing and technology backbone of the global economy. When their energy supply costs spike unpredictably, the effects cascade through semiconductor supply chains, automotive production, electronics manufacturing, and 100 other industrial networks that the entire developed world depends on. Tehran understood this. That was the entire point. The strategy was never to sink American warships. The strategy was to impose costs, diffuse, structural, economically distributed costs, on a web of American allies and partners who would then pressure Washington into a position of restraint. Geography as a weapon. The strait as a lever against the global system rather than against any single enemy. What the Iranian calculation missed, and this is the structural flaw that is now becoming visible, is that the same geography which gives Tehran leverage also imprisons it. The Strait of Hormuz is not just the exit point for global energy. It is also the entry point for Iranian trade, Iranian oil revenue, and the foreign currency that keeps the Iranian government functional. When the United States established naval dominance over that corridor, it did not merely protect outbound commercial shipping. It effectively encircled the Iranian economy from the seaward side. Iranian oil exports, already heavily sanctioned and rerouted through shadow tanker networks, became almost entirely frozen. Port activity at Bandar Abbas dropped. The currency markets in Tehran reacted not gradually but violently, with the rial falling against the dollar at a pace that signals genuine financial panic rather than managed devaluation. This is the silent war of systems and logistics, and it cuts deeper than any missile strike. A military engagement destroys equipment. An economic encirclement destroys the capacity to replace it. Iran's military budget, its ability to manufacture and import drone components, to resupply missile stockpiles, to maintain the logistics network that connects its proxy forces across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, all of that runs on oil revenue. And that revenue is now being strangled in real time. The math is brutal and it is moving quickly. What makes this moment genuinely unprecedented and genuinely dangerous is the speed of the compression. Previous sanctions regimes worked on timescales of years. Supply chains adjusted. Black market networks expanded. Workarounds appeared. The Iranian government had time to manage internal pressure, redistribute pain, and project an image of resistance and endurance to its domestic audience. What is happening now is different. The military pressure and the economic pressure are arriving simultaneously, and they are reinforcing each other in ways that leave very little room for managed adaptation. Supermarket supply chains in major Iranian cities are already showing stress. Essential goods are becoming harder to find. Ordinary Iranians who have spent years enduring hardship because they were told their government was building strategic leverage against foreign enemies are now watching that leverage being dismantled in real time, and the hardship remains. That combination, continued sacrifice without visible strategic return, is historically one of the most destabilizing forces a government can face. This is where the contrasting narratives become most important to understand. The official story, as presented by Iranian state media, maintains a posture of defiance. Revolutionary Guard commanders speak of asymmetric capacity, of the ability to absorb pressure and respond asymmetrically. The messaging toward domestic audiences emphasizes historical resilience, the narrative of a nation that has survived sanctions and threats before. But there is another reality visible beneath that narrative, and it is showing through the cracks. Military units that once operated with visible confidence in harassing commercial shipping are now staying in port. The operational tempo of IRGC Navy activity has dropped sharply. The drone swarms that were presented as an equalizing technology capable of overwhelming American air defenses are being shot out of the sky faster than they can be replenished. The hidden reality and the official narrative are moving in opposite directions, and that gap is exactly the kind of structural pressure that produces sudden, unpredictable outcomes. Now expand the frame outward, because this conflict does not end at the Iranian coastline. The permanent shift in global power balance that is becoming visible here has consequences that will reshape relationships across the entire international system. China is watching this with an intensity that cannot be overstated. Beijing imports more oil through the Strait of Hormuz than any other country on Earth. Its entire industrial strategy, its manufacturing base, its ability to sustain economic growth, all of it carries a structural dependency on that corridor remaining open and affordable. For years, Chinese strategists treated Iranian military capability as a useful complication in American strategic planning, a pressure point that kept Washington tied down and distracted. The current scenario is revealing the other side of that calculation. Iranian disruption of the strait is not just a problem for American allies. It is a direct threat to Chinese energy security. Beijing's response to the current crisis has been notably muted, and that silence carries meaning. The traditional assumption that China and Iran share aligned interests against American power is far more conditional than it appeared. European governments are recalculating as well, though for different reasons. The energy transition away from fossil fuels was always described as a long-term project measured in decades. What the current crisis is demonstrating is how fragile the existing energy infrastructure remains in the interim period. How quickly a single geographic choke point can translate into European industrial vulnerability. The political consequences of energy price spikes inside EU member states are not abstract. They are electoral. They reshape domestic politics in ways that feed directly into debates about defense spending, NATO commitment, and the willingness of European publics to sustain any kind of serious foreign policy position that carries economic cost. For India, the calculus is uniquely complex. New Delhi has been one of the largest buyers of discounted Iranian crude during the sanctions era, quietly building an energy relationship that Tehran valued as a lifeline. The current military confrontation places India in an impossible position, caught between its energy interests, its strategic partnership with the United States, and its instinct to maintain strategic autonomy by not visibly aligning with any single power bloc. How India navigates the next few weeks will say something significant about whether that balancing act remains viable or whether the compression of the crisis is finally forcing choices that can no longer be deferred. And then there is the question that no public official is willing to answer directly, but which is shaping every private conversation inside every relevant government and military command right now. What happens next inside Iran itself? The regime has spent 4 decades surviving external pressure by converting it into a narrative of national resistance. That narrative requires the external pressure to remain manageable, painful enough to justify sacrifice, but not so overwhelming that ordinary citizens begin asking whether the sacrifice is rational. The current trajectory is pushing toward a threshold where that narrative breaks down. The moment it does, the range of possible outcomes expands dramatically, not just toward negotiation and compromise, but also toward desperate military escalation, toward internal power struggles, toward the kind of sudden, chaotic state fragility that produces outcomes nobody planned for and nobody can control. This is not a situation moving toward clean resolution. This is a situation moving toward a decision point, and the decision is not being made in any single capital or by any single leader. It is being made by the accumulating weight of economic data, military exchange rates, and the private calculations of people inside the Iranian system who are beginning to ask whether the current strategy can actually succeed, or whether what is unfolding in real time is not a temporary crisis to be endured, but a permanent structural shift that has already changed the fundamental equation. Geography is being reshaped as a weapon, but in this case, the weapon was always double-edged. The same geography that gave Tehran leverage has become the mechanism of its encirclement. The question now, the question that will define the next chapter of this story, is whether the people making decisions inside Iran recognize that reality clearly enough and quickly enough to act on it before the pressure crosses a threshold that makes rational calculation impossible. This changes everything on a structural level, not just in the Gulf, not just for Iran and the United States, for the entire architecture of how energy moves, how military force projects, and how the global order distributes power in a world where geography is still, despite everything, the most unforgiving strategic fact of all. At NEXA World Brief, we are going to keep tracking every development as this unfolds, because the real question, the one nobody in the official briefing rooms will say out loud, is not whether Iran bends. It is what breaks first, and what happens to the rest of the world when it does.